Hello, good afternoon. My name is Melissa Drew. I've been working with data for over 27 years now, since 1995, and I started writing AI models in 2004. Currently, I'm the associate editor for AI Time Journal, which is a global digital magazine, and a podcast host for The Impact of AI, where over the past year, I've been lucky enough to interview some of the well-known CIOs and chief data officers with some global organizations. Today, I want to talk to you about the diversity of data and why it's so important that we represent our data, which is the same as how we're representing our end users. There is a perception that still exists that if the AI solution was more trustworthy because the data was used by an AI machine, but really the opposite is more likely, because every time we have a human that touches the data, we have an opportunity for an error. And each time we touch the data throughout that data model and model development process before we get to production, the gap widens. So I want to talk a little bit about some examples that are fairly well known where they used incomplete or biased data sets. For example, Amazon a couple years ago released a automated resume screener, but unfortunately it filtered out female candidates. Now, the reason this occurred is because when they were piloting the resume screener, only males submitted their resumes. And when Amazon used that retrospective data, unfortunately, only male resumes were a part of the AI models, and therefore, when the resume screener went live to production, it automatically filtered out female candidates, and female candidates weren't even included. Another good example, because we've been talking a little bit today about some of our healthcare and data science, is there was a study published in the Journal of Internal Medicine and found that software, which is software that's utilizing AI technology, we call that software as a medical device, the software was used by these hospitals that prioritized kidney transplants over a certain demographic. And the reason for that was the retrospective data that was used did not provide enough coverage. So for example, in utilizing the data of all the kidney transplants within a certain time frame, during that time frame, there wasn't enough Black or Latin America or other demographics that were being represented in that data. And then additionally, when the data was being pulled, it wasn't looking at all the hospitals in a large geographic sphere. It was looking at a smaller subset of data with not a lot of Black patients and only within a certain geographical demographic. And then finally, another one, and this is interesting because it's actually the opposite of what you would think, but in Scientific America, the study falsely concluded that Black patients were healthier than white patients here in the US. And what was interesting is the retrospective data was actually quite comprehensive, but one of the data attributes that were used was cost. And when the study was, when we went and looked at the study and looked at the data behind it, we recognized that a lot of the Black patients weren't spending as much money on healthcare than, say, white patients. And therefore, when cost was used as a proxy, it automatically bumped up anybody that had a lower cost within their healthcare. So these are some really good examples of where some of these larger companies have gone live with production with AI, but not really put a lot of thought into the foundation, which is the data, where the data came from, how it was being used, how it was being interpreted. And then as it went live, as you can see, it ended up, creating some failures. So I'm going to look at data bias in two primary sources, and I recognize that I could probably look at this in 8 or 9 different, but I'm going to consolidate this into the two primary areas: the data or the algorithm bias, and then the social bias. So data algorithm bias, we use the incomplete data sets. We use maybe more retrospective data, not really thinking about prospective data. We don't think about how we're collecting the data or labeling the data. Maybe we're cleansing the data and we're changing how the data was originally intended. Oftentimes we'll enrich the data. So we'll take the raw data and then we'll add to it, or we'll take some of the abbreviations and maybe expand those abbreviations incorrectly. One of the examples I wanted to mention was Starbucks. Starbucks, just in their global customized rewards program, and this is the program where you get the customized emails, or if you're on your mobile phone, you get a customized um, a reward that says if you go out and buy something that you've already bought, we'll give you additional points for it. Well, just in that one little example, Starbucks uses over 400,000 individual data attributes to ensure that they're representing their data, their customers, and their customers' needs. Additionally, we have social bias. So this is where the data is now moved into the development of the models, and it's written by individuals who inadvertently have blind spots. And it's not something that happens, on purpose. It's not intended, but perhaps they're junior and they don't really understand the larger perspective. They misinterpret what the purpose of the data is supposed to be doing. They truly don't understand what problem it is they're trying to solve. They evaluate the data in a way that skews the results. And oftentimes I hear this a lot. I didn't know what I didn't know. And, early in my career, I thought that's just silly. How could you not know something that you didn't know? You can just ask people. But now I'm seeing this more and more, specifically within the data office and the analytics office, where a lot of folks are coming into this environment, and we're hiring a lot of individuals with a variety of skill sets and a variety of perspectives of their world. And they're using those perspectives that they have to interpret the data, try to interpret the problem that's coming in from the organization. So where does this bias occur? It's often and always going to occur before you get to production. So if we look at this in two different areas, we've got our data development, and then that data gets used in the model development. But that bias occurs again when we have the touch points. So maybe the data doesn't exist. As we talked about some of the examples, when we looked at Amazon, Amazon data didn't have female resumes, so the data didn't exist. And what they did is they went forward with that production in a poor quality application. The data itself is of poor quality, and you end up enriching or cleansing the data, which then transforms the data to inadvertently misalign the intent of the raw data that you collected. The data is not representative of your user base. Not being able to pull in all the dimensions or the attributes of socioeconomics, looking at geographical, recognizing that if you have a problem within the US and then you take that same data set and want to use that to solve a similar problem over in the Asia Pacific, that data is not going to be truly representative of that Asia Pacific geographical. Data selection for models. So another thing that we're seeing is the data is actually really good and it is comprehensive, and they've really thought about the geographical and all the different variables, but the data that they selected to put into the model may have been skewed. And a lot of times that communication between the individuals collecting the data and the individuals who are creating the AI, we're seeing that in larger organizations, these are two different groups, sometimes under two different areas of the organization. And these folks are so in there just building the data that they misinterpret or they miscommunicate how that data is supposed to be used in the model development. So then therefore we see the team that's developing the models, that there's this mismatch between the data that was given to them and the purpose of what the model's using. Misaligned assumptions or inferences in the results. So this goes back to, I didn't know what I didn't know. When I take the data model, and we've talked to folks who may do some initial code development. So they develop the code, they go through the model, they run their own tests to make sure that their model's working. But in their interpretation of the test, they're interpreting or inferring that the test was accurate. And then it doesn't happen until later, when it goes to production, that their inferences of what that data and that model was supposed to solve is completely different than what it was intended. Sometimes we're seeing where someone will come in, a third party of the organization, and change the training data completely, which then means that if this was not communicated, then the entire process needs to be started all over again. And then finally, we're seeing a lot of lack of training data and not really a true comprehensive training set, or no auditing, or no third party in the organization coming in and really looking at those models. Now, one of the questions that we get a lot is, well, what's the right amount of data? And the right amount of data is something that's interpreted individually. For example, throughout my year, I've been able to interview a lot of organizations globally, and I've heard, data sets coming from 40,000 data sets to up to 140,000 data sets. And in talking to folks in healthcare, it's even much more than that. And because the healthcare, as we listened from the previous speaker, healthcare has a much higher risk threshold of what's accurate and not accurate. So ultimately, why does diversity matter? Diversity matters because the underlying foundation is the consumer or the user of AI, whether it's internal to your organization or external, has to feel comfortable that understanding how the data is used and making the right decisions. And if we look at it from an organizational aspect, yes, there's the negative impacts, the risk, the brand reputation, penalties and fees for legal actions. Some of the legal actions that we discussed earlier, Apple's credit card is actually under investigation by many of the states in the US because it has been thought that that the Apple credit card was discriminating against women. And that has caused a lot of legal fees for Apple. Brand loyalty and brand reputation, that's those opportunity costs that you potentially could have revenue this year, next year, and even 3-5 years down the road. So it's not just looking at it from the organization's perspective, but it's also making sure that we're representing the users that we're building that AI for. How did we get here? Oftentimes I get the question, well, that's great, Melissa, but in order to understand where to go, we need to understand how we got here. And a lot of our culture, not just in the US, but everywhere, in other areas of the globe, a lot of our culture is around how do we reduce conflict? There's something called the similarity attraction paradigm. And this states that people who are like-minded will work better, communicate better, and have less conflict. And so therefore, that attraction, that similarity attraction, wanting people to be able to work better and have less conflict, was thought for a long time to be the best way to solve problems. And as a result, it is followed into the rest of the organization. Hiring, we still have studies even within the last 6 months that highlight that certain demographics are not receiving interviews over others. And as hiring has expanded here in the US, we've asked other individuals within our company to help us with the hiring, to pre-qualify individuals or to be a part of the interview process. And what we've realized is that the recommendations from some of those individuals are recommending people that were like-minded or similar to themselves. And as a result, we're going back to the similarity attraction paradigm. And then finally, in our career development and progression, supervisors and managers may still have that lingering bias, even though they took a company-wide mandatory class. So for example, and this happened recently within the last 3 years, an individual that I spoke to was working for a large global consulting firm. And as she went through the hiring phase, she noticed that all the men were male and white, but she continued to move forward. She went to the company, worked there for about 3 months, and she was given a coach, someone that can help her navigate through the company, someone that can provide her with insights on how to become, successful and set her up for success. And when the individual that was assigned to her was a woman, which great, that sounds great. But rather the opposite, occurred. In this scenario, the woman coach, the female coach, had nothing to do with this individual. It was in a completely different department. There was nothing similar around them. And really the only thing that was connecting them was that she was a female. So when this friend of mine, reached out into the leadership and said, "Hey, I really think I would like this guy to be my coach because I think he better represents what it is I'm trying to do with my career. He can help me navigate the politics of the company." And the response to her was, Oh, we gave you her as a coach because you're a woman. And that was a very interesting conversation to have because it was actually the reverse of what we expected. And this individual, the entire company, had gone through a company-wide mandatory class on how to mitigate bias, but it still had this lingering afterthought that it wasn't recognizing this individual, this female, as a woman, as an individual, so that she could be successful. It was just recognizing that she was a woman and therefore she must have a woman as her boss. So a lot of this, culture of reducing conflict has inadvertently led us to lack of diversity within our organization, lack of diversity in who is out there to support us, and ultimately that lack of diversity flows immediately and directly into the data that we're collecting. So where do we start? The first step is to recognize that there's a problem. And this sounds really simple, but it's not. At least it hasn't been in the last 5 years. Acknowledging that there is disparity in the organization oftentimes occurs at the lower levels of the organization, but isn't something that's truly being acknowledged at the leadership. And leadership, executive leadership, directors, VPs, the C-suite, they still don't have a full acknowledgement and an understanding that the disparity exists. Once that acknowledgement exists, then it's really recognizing the diversity in leadership is critical. And what we talk about here is the front seat leader. Oftentimes, we will see somebody in the C-suite who recognizes or acknowledges that that disparity exists, but doesn't say anything. And what we say is that sometimes when a leader doesn't say anything, they're actually saying quite a bit. It's sitting on the sidelines. It's sitting in the back seat. So what we want is not only do we want to recognize diversity in leadership as critical, but we want the leaderships to move forward into the front seat and support and take action. And then finally, when you get to those two steps, you now have a culture or you now have the foundation that will allow the leadership and the rest of the organization to foster a culture where differences matter. In other words, it's okay to ask questions. There's no such thing as a dumb question or a stupid question or a silly question. It's okay to ask why we're doing something this way because maybe the company has done it this way for the last 21 years and no one's ever stepped back to think that there was a different way that we could do it. So fostering that organizational culture where differences matter is definitely the next step. Developing a framework to to develop that trustworthy AI. And number 5, to adopt a change mindset. We're going to go through these number 4 and 5 in the next slides. But adopting that mindset that includes data and model development, that includes governance, not only prior to production, but we often forget that there's data model changes and impacts to the data post-production. So what does that AI framework look like? So we've broken this down into 4 different areas. First, data, I'm going to start in with the data fairness and the data bias. How do we mitigate our data bias? How do we know how much data we need to collect? Again, we talk about what is the right set of data. What's the coverage of the data? One of the examples that we had recently is an individual was taking the data that was given to them and using it to develop the model and decided that the best way to do the data was to combine it all into one. And unfortunately, combining all the data, which may have made it easier to use and easier to, run through the model, inadvertently caused a huge disparity by combining that data. Where does that selection bias exist when the population doesn't reflect the data? What are the areas that we have, the checklist that talks about these are the things that you need to think about? Ultimately, understanding the problem is going to be supporting in helping you understand what's the right data. And just because we collect 140,000 data sets doesn't mean that we need to use all 140,000 data sets. Sometimes a lot of data that's just adding a whole bunch of miscellaneous information, sometimes we've noticed that that also skews the results on the opposite end. Influence and robustness. And this goes back to what we talked about with our data modelers and our model developers. How do we ensure that there is no negative influence inadvertently being built from the individuals creating the models, the individuals testing the models, and the individuals making that decision that this test is accurate based on the problem? How do we avoid providing an advantage to some individuals versus not? Explainability. So when we're running those tests, can we look at the data results and explain why, if I randomly took two individuals where one received a loan and the others didn't, can I dig into the data and truly understand why that happened? If I can't explain it, then it's not something that I need to work with. I need to go back and rethink it. Transparency. Is there a fact sheet or a data sheet that outlines what the data sources were used, outlines the decisions that were made, and more importantly, outlines the assumptions? Because at no point in time have I ever seen any data models written without a small or a very long list of the assumptions made. And those assumptions are going to be needed as we move further down into the pipeline. So at minimum, your AI framework should include representation of data fairness or data bias. How do we negatively impact that influence? Can we explain the results in a way that makes sense and that other people can understand it in a very simplistic way? And then also representing and documenting, whether it's a fact sheet or a data sheet that highlights, encompasses all of that. Action plan. How do we get started? What can we do? What can you guys do tomorrow? As soon as you go back to your offices, look at your hiring practices. Think a little bit differently about your hiring practices. For example, in the example that I gave you earlier about a friend of mine who interviewed, it was recognized quite obviously that throughout the entire interview process, it was all men and it was all white men. And when this was raised, what was interesting was the reaction. Huh, well, that's very interesting. We didn't realize that that's what we had done, but that's what they had done for the last, 15 years. So just that one individual who was asking questions and not afraid of conflict, within 6 weeks after raising that, was able to change the practices of the hiring within that department. And going forward, there was always much more diversity within the hiring and the interviews, which then allowed a much wider diversity of individuals that were being hired. Recognizing that global virtual teams is okay. I know sometimes the time zones get a little in the way, but now that we've gone through COVID and we're a little bit more comfortable with having global virtual teams, this is something that we should definitely continue forward. 21st century skills. So this is something that I'm very interested in. The 21st century skills. What are they? I'll name just the top four: communication, creativity, critical thinking, and collaboration. The 21st century skills means that our data experts and the individuals pulling the data, the individuals who are creating those models, they need to be able to collaboratively communicate, effectively communicate, be able to explain in a very simple way, this is what I did, here are the decisions I made, here's why the model worked the way it was. Maybe we should be asking some more questions. Collaboration, not only collaborating with your team, but maybe collaborating with folks outside their team that may have a perspective on the data and the models being used. Creativity, stepping back, critical thinking, all of these things are what we call the 21st century skill sets that maybe we weren't looking for them earlier within the hiring practices or within the dynamics of our team. Continuing with the teams, bias training. We are hiring a lot of new individuals coming in from colleges and from research. A lot of them may not have a true understanding of what bias is, but we're not seeing a lot of training within the teams. And as we shift over into data model, looking at that fact sheet, what we have noticed in the US that's really getting a lot of success and elsewhere is the model review board. So there's a financial services company that I interviewed recently, and they have a very robust and very detailed process, But even after the model's been tested individually, they go to a third-party team, a group of individuals at all different levels of the organization who review the models and ask questions. And as more questions are being asked, the model developers and the individuals are explaining or defending, like you do in a thesis. And oftentimes it doesn't get past the model review board and it has to go back, and the data and the models need to be rethought. Another thing that's just starting to take hold as a trend is the individuals within the model groups are reaching out to maybe third-party individuals who have a more subject matter knowledge within the problem that's being solved. Somebody who's dealt with diversity or has dealt with bias that can provide some insights. And then finally, the governance piece. And this has actually been quite important because up until now, we've gone through the development of the data, we've gone through the development of the AI, and then we just push it off into production. And as you can see from the earlier examples, oftentimes pushing that into production, especially when it's going out into the public, can have some really detrimental negative impacts. Your company needs to think through, what exactly is my risk threshold? At what point do I need to stop and pull this back in? And the challenge here is that a lot of companies, particularly if you're developing something that's going to be out in the public or you're going to sell it, these companies want to get to production as soon as possible. And so there's this interaction between the folks that are developing this and the data and the folks that really want to push this out, that interaction between the C-suite and everyone else. So before you even start anything else, establishing that risk threshold, where and how comfortable are you that if you don't solve 1, 2, 3 of this problem, that this isn't really something that should go out into the post-production world. And then finally, post-production itself. We often forget that we've put a lot of effort into our teams, our data, developing the models, testing it. It's finally out there. And then what we find is we don't have a group of people that are really looking at that model post-production. And what we see is this data drift, this drift between where's the problem that we were solving at the point in time that we went to production, and recognizing that how the data is being used changes over time. And the larger that data drift falls, the larger the gaps and the negativity of how that diversity impacts the data. Ultimately, what we like to see is a checklist or an assessment that can evaluate the project selection. What exactly is going to make a successful project? Don't go after the first one, don't go after the second one, but really think through, what do you need to do to create a successful project? And then additionally, a checklist for your teams. What exactly is the right kind of data? What kind of testing methodology or culture methodology should we incorporate? So as I recap, there's a couple things I just want to highlight. AI is here to stay. It's actually been around for quite a bit of time. It's not a trend. It's not going to go anywhere. And we recognize that there are no shortcuts. A lot of folks think we just create the AI, it happens overnight, and that's not necessarily true. There are several organizations, a lot of organizations who have been developing their AI and their solutions for 4 years before they actually make that known to the public. Be creative with your recruitment. Think a little bit differently. Work with your HR folks or on your small businesses. Think differently about how you can hire those individuals, where you can hire those individuals. Again, global virtual teams are a good thing. Your teams will have to understand how to explain their models, whether it's going to be in that model review board that we talked about, or whether it's going to be something larger. Here in the US, the FDA, the Federal Drug and Administration, has actually started to rethink how they're looking and approving software as medical devices. That is, medical devices that are using AI within the software solution. Over the last year, as they've overhauled how they evaluate and approve these medical solutions, one of the things that they're considering is to go back to the organization and talk to the teams who created those models and created those algorithms and ask them to explain it. So now we're really starting to see those 21st century skill sets are going to become much more important. You can't improve what you don't measure. So this is going back to looking at a very clear checklist of what exactly is it that I'm going to be doing. educating the organization to embrace AI and data culture. And that's not something you guys can do overnight. It has to be a larger group within the organization. It's pulling in that front seat leader that's not going to sit on the sidelines. It's developing a set of principles